The air inside Terminal 4 of the John F. Kennedy International Airport was thick with the suffocating humidity of a late August heatwave and the frantic, electric energy of a holiday weekend. Thousands of travelers surged like a human tide, their voices blending into a dull, rhythmic roar that echoed off the vaulted glass ceilings. In the center of this chaos stood Marcus Thorne. He looked like a ghost in a sea of vibrant tourists, a man carved out of granite, standing perfectly still while the world rushed past him. His army surplus jacket was faded at the elbows, the fabric frayed and smelling faintly of old cedar and the exhaust of the city bus he'd taken to get here. He gripped the strap of a battered canvas duffel bag, his knuckles white against his dark skin. Every few minutes, he reached into his pocket to touch a small, hard object, his eyes softening with a grief so deep it seemed to anchor him to the floor. To the casual observer, he was just another struggling veteran, a man the city had chewed up and forgotten. 50 feet away, Julian Vane was having a very different experience. Julian didn't walk through the airport, he conquered it. Dressed in a charcoal-colored three-piece suit that cost more than most people's annual rent, he marched toward the gate with his gold-plated smartphone pressed firmly to his ear. He barked orders at a subordinate 3 time zones away, his voice cutting through the terminal's din with the sharp, practiced edge of a man who had never been told no. His leather briefcase swung at his side, polished to a mirror shine, catching the overhead lights like a weapon. He didn't see people, he saw obstacles. He shouldered past a family of 4 and nearly knocked over a child's suitcase without a second glance, his eyes fixed on the glowing blue sign of the priority boarding lane. The collision happened in a heartbeat. Marcus had shifted his weight to adjust the heavy bag when Julian tried to slice through a gap in the line that wasn't there. The corner of Julian's pristine briefcase clipped Marcus's duffel bag with a dull thud. Julian recoiled as if he had been struck by a physical blow. He stopped dead, his phone call forgotten, and looked down at his bag with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. He pulled a silk handkerchief from his breast pocket and began frantically buffing the spot where the bags had touched, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. He looked up at Marcus, his lip curling into a sneer that dripped with condescension. He didn't just see a man who had bumped into him, he saw a blemish on his perfect world. Sarah, a young flight attendant with tired eyes and a forced professional smile, stepped forward to check the boarding passes. She had been on her feet for 10 hours, and the tension radiating off the man in the suit made her stomach knot. Julian didn't wait for her to speak. He stepped into Marcus's personal space, his expensive cologne clashing violently with the scent of Marcus's old jacket. He gestured toward Marcus with a flick of his wrist, as if he were pointing at a pile of trash on a sidewalk. He asked Sarah if the airline had suddenly lowered its standards so far that they were letting just anyone into the first-class lane. He spoke as if Marcus wasn't standing right there, his voice loud enough to make the surrounding passengers turn and stare. Julian's laughter was dry and metallic. He reached into his wallet, pulled out a wad of $100 bills, and tossed them onto Sarah's podium. He told her to find a way to move this man to the very back of the plane, preferably near the engines or the lavatories, because he didn't feel safe or comfortable sitting next to someone who looked like they'd just crawled out of a trench. He leaned in closer to Marcus, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper, telling him that people like him were meant to be seen and not heard, preferably from a distance. Throughout the entire tirade, Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't shout, and he didn't raise his hands. He simply turned his head and looked Julian directly in the eyes. It was a gaze that had stared down snipers and navigated boardrooms, a look of such profound, icy calm that for a split second, Julian's bravado wavered. Marcus didn't say a single word. He just stood there, his silence acting as a mirror that reflected Julian's ugliness back at him for everyone in the gate area to see. Sarah felt a lump in her throat as she looked at Marcus's first-class ticket. Her hands trembled as she handed it back to him, whispering a small, helpless apology that the roar of the terminal swallowed whole. The boarding call chime rang out, a sharp, digital tone that signaled the beginning of a journey none of them would ever forget. Marcus stepped forward, his boots heavy on the jet bridge, while Julian followed behind, still muttering about his rights and his safety, unaware that he was walking straight into a trap of his own making. The hum of the aircraft engines served as a low, vibrating backdrop to the heavy silence in the first-class cabin, but for Marcus, the sound triggered a memory from 20 years ago that was much louder and much darker. He closed his eyes, and suddenly, he wasn't sitting in a plush leather seat. He was back in a dimly lit, grease-stained garage in South Philadelphia. The air there had been thick with the smell of gasoline and burnt rubber, and his hands had been permanently stained black from engine oil. He remembered the bone-deep fatigue of working 16-hour shifts, his back aching as he slid under rusted chassis. Also, he could keep his younger brother, David, in medical school. Every cent he earned was a brick in the foundation of David's future. He had lived on canned beans and tap water, sleeping on a cot in the back of that garage, possessed by a singular, fierce pride that his brother would never have to know the weight of a wrench or the sting of poverty. But the world had a way of demanding more from Marcus than just sweat and labor. He remembered the day he traded his grease-stained coveralls for a desert camouflaged uniform. He had served with honor, leading a platoon through the kind of heat that melted the soles of your boots, eventually earning a Silver Star for pulling 3 men out of a burning transport under heavy fire. When he returned home, he expected a fresh start, but the reality was a cold shower of indifference. He took a job as a night shift security guard at a burgeoning tech firm just to make ends meet while he plotted his next move. It was there, in a sterile, glass-walled lobby, that he first encountered a younger, even more arrogant Julian Vane. Marcus could still see Julian's father, a man with skin like parchment and a heart like flint, standing over his son and pointing at Marcus as if he were a piece of office furniture. Julian's father had told him that the world was divided into predators and prey, and that men like the guard at the door were merely scenery in their play. A week later, Julian had walked into that same lobby and fired Marcus without even looking him in the eye. He had been looking for cost-cutting measures, and decided the veteran at the desk wasn't worth the minimum wage he was being paid. Julian hadn't known that Marcus used that final paycheck to make his first small investment in a private security startup, a company that would eventually grow into a global empire while Marcus remained its ghost-like, anonymous architect. The memories shifted to a more recent, more painful clarity. He thought of David, the brilliant doctor who had spent his life treating the underserved, only to be taken by a sudden, aggressive illness. Marcus had spent the last year pouring millions into a state-of-the-art oncology wing at the city's most prestigious hospital, keeping his name off the press releases because David was the one who deserved the glory. He was on this flight to attend the dedication ceremony for the David Thorne Memorial Wing, carrying his brother's favorite stethoscope in that worn duffel bag as a talisman. Marcus felt a sharp jolt against his shoulder, snapping him back to the present. Julian was shifting in seat 1B, intentionally bumping his elbow against Marcus's arm as he reached for a champagne glass. Julian looked at Marcus's faded jacket and let out a short, mocking puff of air. He leaned over and told Marcus that he should probably enjoy the seat while he could, because once they landed, he was going to make sure the airline flagged Marcus as a security risk. Julian's voice was high and nasal, the sound of a man who had never once had to work until his hands bled. He told Marcus that it was a tragedy of modern travel that a man of his stature had to share oxygen with someone who looked like they belonged in a breadline. Marcus didn't turn his head. He just reached into his pocket and gripped the silver medal he always carried, the medal cold and solid against his palm. He thought about the millions of dollars he had funneled into Julian's struggling tech firm through 3 different holding companies over the last 6 months, essentially keeping Julian's lifestyle afloat without the man even knowing it. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He looked out the small oval window at the clouds passing by, thinking of how easily people like Julian mistook a quiet life for a failed one. Julian continued to mutter insults, recording a video on his phone about the uncomfortable situation in first class, completely oblivious to the fact that the man he was mocking was the only reason his company hadn't declared bankruptcy 3 weeks ago. The tension in the cabin was rising, a storm front building between 2 seats, and Marcus knew that before this plane touched down, the predator and the prey were going to switch roles in a way Julian Vane could never survive. The aircraft had barely reached its cruising altitude of 30,000 feet when the simmering tension in seat 1B finally boiled over into a calculated act of malice. Julian Vane sat perched on the edge of his seat, his eyes darting toward Marcus with a look of pure, concentrated loathing. He reached for his glass of Cabernet, swirling the deep red liquid with a practiced, arrogant hand. Then, with a sudden, jerky movement that was anything but accidental, he tipped the entire glass over the armrest. The dark wine cascaded like a crimson waterfall, soaking directly into Marcus's lap and splashing across the worn canvas of his duffel bag. Julian didn't gasp, he didn't apologize. Instead, he let out a sharp, barking laugh that echoed through the quiet cabin. He leaned back, spreading his hands in a mock gesture of helplessness, and told Marcus that he should really watch where he keeps his junk, as he had mistaken his lap for a trash bin. He added with a sneer that it was hard to tell the difference given the rags Marcus was wearing. The humiliation was public and immediate. Sarah, the flight attendant, came rushing down the aisle with a handful of napkins, her face tight with a mixture of pity and professional panic. As she knelt down to help Marcus blot the wine from his jacket, Julian snapped his fingers sharply, the sound like a whip crack in the small space. He barked at her to stop wasting airline resources on the help, and demanded she bring him a fresh glass of wine immediately. He told her that he was paying for her time, not the man sitting next to him, and he didn't appreciate his service being interrupted by a clumsy charity case. Sarah's hands trembled as she looked between the two men, her voice barely a whisper as she told Julian that she was simply doing her job. From across the aisle in seat 2A, Mrs. Gable, a sharp-eyed grandmother in a pearl necklace, couldn't stay silent any longer. She leaned over and told Julian that his behavior was absolutely disgraceful and that he should be ashamed of himself for treating another human being with such disrespect. Julian didn't even turn his head to look at her. He simply told the old bird to mind her own business and keep her mouth shut before he called the airline's corporate office and had her blacklisted from future flights, suggesting she'd be better off checking into a nursing home where her opinions might actually matter. Desperate to finalize his victory, Julian pressed the call button repeatedly until the onboard air marshal, a stern man named Miller, made his way to the front of the cabin. Julian launched into a frantic, high-pitched performance, claiming that Marcus had made a threatening gesture toward him and was muttering about taking the plane down. He demanded that Marcus be restrained immediately for the safety of the passengers, citing his own high status in the tech industry as proof of his reliability. Marcus remained perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees, his face a mask of ironclad dignity. He was completely isolated. The other first-class passengers stared at their laps or pretended to be engrossed in their tablets, unwilling to risk the wrath of a man who looked like he had the power to ruin lives. Miller, the air marshal, looked from the red wine stains on Marcus's clothes to the frantic, sweating executive. He told Marcus that he needed to stay perfectly still and keep his hands visible at all times, warning him that any sudden movement would be treated as a hostile act. Julian leaned over one last time, his breath smelling of expensive grapes and cheap ego, and whispered that when they landed, he was going to make sure Marcus never flew again. He told him that he owned this city, and by the time he was done, Marcus would be lucky to get a job cleaning the floors he walked on. Marcus caught Sarah's eye for a fleeting second and gave her a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a plea for help, it was a signal of intent. The trap was locked, and Julian Vane was walking deeper into the darkness with every word he spoke. The tension inside the cabin reached a fever pitch as the air marshal, his face set in a grim mask of duty, reached into Marcus's wine-soaked duffel bag to inspect the threat Julian had signaled. The entire first-class cabin held its breath, the only sound the low, mechanical drone of the jet engines. When Miller pulled out a small, metallic object with protruding wires and a digital interface, a collective gasp rippled through the seats. Julian let out a triumphant, jagged laugh, his phone held high to record the scene. He shouted that he knew it, that he had a sixth sense for these things, and he demanded that Marcus be restrained immediately. Within seconds, the cold, heavy bite of steel handcuffs snapped shut around Marcus's wrists, pinning him to the seat. It was a picture of total defeat. The decorated veteran sat bound and humiliated, while the tech executive preened for his social media followers, narrating the capture of a criminal with a smug, self-satisfied grin. But as Miller leaned in to secure the restraints, Marcus didn't struggle. He didn't beg. Instead, he leaned his head back against the headrest and let out a soft, dry chuckle that stopped Julian mid-sentence. Marcus turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto Julian's with a sudden, predatory sharpness that hadn't been there before. He spoke in a voice that was no longer tired or humble, but resonant with the authority of a man who held the world in his hands. He told Julian to check his phone's stock alerts, because while he was busy filming a viral video, his company's lead investor had just pulled out, causing his shares to plummet into the dirt. Julian's smirk flickered. He glanced down at his screen, his eyes widening as a string of frantic notifications began to scroll past. His board of directors was in a full-blown panic. Marcus looked back at the air marshal and told him to look closer at the device in his hand. He explained, with a calm that was terrifying, that it wasn't a detonator, but a specialized, high-frequency heart monitor designed for a child, a final gift for his brother's last patient at the hospital they were flying to honor. He told Miller to check the serial number on the back, which would lead directly to the Thorne Global Medical Division. The air marshal's hands hesitated as he turned the device over, his professional suspicion beginning to melt into a cold, sinking realization that he had made a massive mistake. The shift in the cabin was instantaneous. Marcus wasn't a victim anymore. He was a planner who had just moved his final piece into place. He leaned toward Julian, who was now pale and trembling, and told him that the anonymous donor his firm had been desperately courting for a $50 million merger wasn't a mystery anymore. He revealed that he was the one who had been vetting Julian for months, waiting to see if the man who fired a veteran 10 years ago had learned a single thing about character or integrity. Marcus told him that he had chosen this specific flight, this specific seat, to give Julian one last chance to be a decent human being. Instead, Julian had spent the last 2 hours proving he was exactly the same coward he had always been. Marcus's mindset had completely transformed from the hunted to the hunter. He told Julian that he didn't need to react with anger because he had already won. He explained that while Julian was playing a game of status and insults, Marcus was playing the long game of justice. He told the air marshal that he wouldn't resist the cuffs for now, because he wanted the record to show exactly what Julian's lies had caused. He instructed Miller to call the captain and tell him that the Phoenix was on board and required a direct line to the ground. The name hit the air marshal like a physical blow. He recognized the high-level security clearance code immediately. As Julian slumped back into his seat, the phone slipping from his nerveless fingers, Marcus sat tall, his bound hands resting quietly on his lap. He looked out at the vast, darkening sky, a man who had lost everything but his dignity, now watching as the man who tried to destroy him began to dismantle his own life, one arrogant word at a time. The cabin fell into a strange, rhythmic quietness as the flight progressed, but beneath the surface, a silent war was being waged. Marcus sat with a stillness that was almost unnatural, his cuffed hands resting on the tray table as if they were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Sarah, the flight attendant, moved toward him with a look of profound respect, leaning down to offer a company tablet. She didn't look at Julian, she looked only at Marcus, her voice a steady anchor as she told him that the captain had authorized full satellite access for his legal and corporate logistics. Marcus thanked her with a small, knowing smile that didn't reach his eyes that were now fixed on the screen, reflecting lines of code and encrypted legal documents. With a series of precise, measured taps, Marcus began the systematic dismantling of Julian Vane's world. He wasn't acting out of petty revenge, he was performing a clinical extraction of a cancer from his business portfolio. He moved through secret meetings and high-stakes calls, his fingers dancing across the glass as he authorized the liquidation of Julian's majority shares and the immediate freezing of the venture capital accounts that had been Julian's lifeblood. Across the narrow aisle, Julian was in a state of manic, delusional triumph. He had spent the last 20 minutes scrolling through the initial comments on his citizen arrest video, which was gaining thousands of views by the second. He tapped on his screen with an aggressive, self-important rhythm, laughing to himself about how he was going to turn this into a PR goldmine. He imagined the headlines: Tech Titan saves flight from terrorist. He even went so far as to order a bottle of the most expensive champagne on the menu, telling Sarah to keep the change from $100 bill he flicked toward her like a piece of used confetti. He believed he had finally scrubbed the trash from his presence, oblivious to the fact that the very man he had mocked was currently signing the documents that would turn Julian's designer suits into rags. Julian's arrogance was a thick, cloying fog that blinded him to the reality of the digital storm breaking over his head. The air in the first-class cabin grew heavy with the weight of the turning tides. Every few minutes, Julian's phone would vibrate with a call from his chief operating officer or his lead attorney, but he swiped them away with a smug roll of his eyes, assuming they were just calling to congratulate him on his viral bravery. He leaned back in his plush seat, closing his eyes and visualizing the bonus he would give himself once the merger, the one Marcus was currently incinerating, went through. He didn't notice the way the air marshal was now standing near the galley, watching him with a look of growing suspicion, nor did he see Marcus's quiet, intense focus as he finalized a phone call with the city's district attorney. Marcus was setting a trap that was as much about legal accountability as it was about social justice. As the plane began its long, slow descent toward the city lights below, the contrast between the two men was a study in the inevitable nature of karma. Marcus closed the tablet and handed it back to Sarah, his expression one of somber, quiet dignity. He had spent the last hour working harder than Julian had in a decade, not for money, but to ensure that the legacy of his brother's hospital remained untainted by the likes of men who valued property over people. The grind was over, the foundation was laid. Julian Vane was celebrating a victory that didn't exist, while Marcus Thorne sat in his stained army jacket, waiting for the cabin doors to open so the world could finally see who was truly wearing the chains. The wheels of the aircraft kissed the tarmac with a violent screech, but for Marcus, it was the sound of a closing trap. As the plane taxied toward a private section of the airfield, far from the standard commercial gates, Julian Vane was already unbuckling his seatbelt, ignoring the illuminated sign and the flight attendant's soft warnings. He was a man possessed by his own reflected glory, checking his reflection in his darkened phone screen and adjusting his silk tie with jerky, nervous motions. He looked over at Marcus, who sat perfectly still in his wine-stained jacket, and let out a short, jagged laugh. Julian told him to take a good look at the window because the motorcade waiting out there was for him, and the police waiting at the end of the tunnel were for Marcus. He sneered that it was funny how the world worked. Some people were born to be on the news, and others were born to be the lead story on a police scanner. When the cabin door finally hissed open, letting in the humid, kerosene-scented night air, Julian shoved his way to the front, nearly knocking Sarah aside. He stepped onto the mobile staircase with his chest puffed out, squinting against the blinding glare of high-intensity spotlights and the rhythmic, blue and red pulse of police cruisers. A small army of men in dark suits, city officials, and local news crews stood gathered in a semicircle. Julian didn't wait to be greeted. He raised his hands like a conquering hero, shouting to the cameras that he was safe and that the threat had been neutralized thanks to his quick thinking. He looked back over his shoulder, waiting for the air marshal to lead Marcus out in shame, his face twisted into a mask of smug, performative righteousness. Among the crowd stood Leo, Julian's long-suffering personal assistant, who was holding a thick manila envelope. Julian snapped his fingers at him, demanding his briefcase and a cold water, but Leo didn't move. In fact, Leo looked at Julian with a mixture of pity and profound exhaustion. Instead of reaching for Julian's luggage, Leo stepped forward and handed him a single, white envelope. He told Julian, in a voice that was flat and devoid of its usual subservience, that he wouldn't be needing a briefcase anymore because he had been officially terminated from the board, effective 10 minutes ago. Julian's laughter died in his throat, replaced by a confused, stuttering protest. He demanded to know who could possibly have the authority to fire him from his own company, his voice cracking as he waved his phone at the mayor and the chief of police, who were both ignoring him. The atmosphere shifted from chaotic to reverent as Marcus Thorne finally appeared in the aircraft doorway. He wasn't the man who had boarded the plane. He had used the final minutes of the descent to change into a tailored, midnight black suit that fit his broad shoulders with military precision. The wine-stained jacket was gone, replaced by a presence that seemed to command the very air around him. As he descended the stairs, the mayor stepped forward, bypassing Julian as if he were a piece of discarded luggage, and extended his hand to Marcus. He thanked him for coming, calling him Mr. Thorne, and expressing the city's deepest gratitude for his monumental contribution to the new hospital wing. Julian stood frozen on the tarmac, his mouth hanging open like a landed fish. He watched as the chief of police nodded respectfully to Marcus and then turned a cold, hard gaze toward Julian. The tech executive tried to scramble for his dignity, stammering that there must be some mistake, that this man was a vagrant who had threatened the flight. But the silence that followed his words was deafening. The crowd wasn't looking at a hero, they were looking at a bully who had finally run out of room to hide. Marcus stood at the center of the gathering, his face a calm, impenetrable mask of iron, while the lights of the city he supposedly owned illuminated the beginning of Julian Vane's very public ending. The silence on the tarmac was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic clicking of cooling aircraft engines and the distant, lonely wail of a siren. Julian Vane stood paralyzed as the mayor shook Marcus's hand, his brain refusing to process the reality unfolding before him. He scrambled forward, his expensive leather shoes scuffing the asphalt as he tried to push through the wall of security. He shouted that there was some kind of insane mistake, that Marcus was a vagrant, a criminal who had tried to blow up the plane with a digital device. He pointed a shaking finger at Marcus, his face twisted in a desperate, ugly mask of denial. He screamed that he was the CEO of Vane Tech, that he was the one bringing billions into the city, and that he demanded this trash be hauled away in chains. Marcus Thorne finally turned to face him. He didn't look angry, he looked disappointed, as if he were observing a faulty piece of machinery. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a slim, black folder, holding it up just long enough for the camera flashes to capture the Thorne Global seal. He told Julian, in a voice that rumbled like low thunder, that he had spent the last 10 years building an empire out of the very dirt Julian had kicked in his face. He revealed that Thorne Global hadn't just been vetting Julian's firm. They had spent the last hour finalizing a hostile takeover. Marcus spoke with a chilling, clinical precision, explaining that Julian didn't own Vane Tech anymore. In fact, he didn't even own the chair he'd been sitting in. Marcus revealed that as of 30 minutes ago, Julian was a trespasser in his own life. The color drained from Julian's face so quickly it was as if a plug had been pulled. He began to stammer, his voice rising into a thin, pathetic whine. He claimed it was all just a misunderstanding, that the stress of high-altitude travel had made him say things he didn't mean, and that he was actually a great admirer of Marcus's work. He tried to laugh, a dry, rattling sound, and reached out to pat Marcus on the shoulder in a desperate show of camaraderie. Marcus stepped back, avoiding the touch as if Julian were contagious. He looked at the executive and told him that he hadn't fired him because of the insults or the red wine spilled on his lap. He told him he was being destroyed because of how he had treated the elderly woman in seat 2A and the way he had snapped his fingers at a hard-working flight attendant as if she were a dog. Marcus turned his head slightly toward the district attorney, who was standing quietly by a police cruiser. He informed Julian that the device he had reported as a bomb was currently being logged as evidence, not against Marcus, but against Julian. The DA stepped forward and informed Julian that he was being charged with filing a false police report and making a fraudulent terroristic threat, both of which were felony offenses. The air marshal, who had followed them down the stairs, stepped toward Julian. With a sharp, metallic clink that echoed across the airfield, the same pair of handcuffs that had been on Marcus's wrists just an hour ago were now snapped firmly around Julian's. Julian's breakdown was total. He fell to his knees on the hard tarmac, sobbing and begging for mercy, his three-piece suit gathering dust and oil. He looked up at the circle of officials, the press, and the man he had called trash, but he found no pity. Marcus looked down at him one last time, his silhouette framed by the glowing lights of the city. He told Julian that the world wasn't divided into predators and prey, as Julian's father had taught him. It was divided into people who built others up and people who tore them down. He delivered the final killing blow with a quiet, devastating calm, telling Julian that he had spent his life trying to be a predator, But in the end, he was just a small, lonely man in a very expensive suit. As the police led the weeping executive toward a waiting car, Marcus turned back to Sarah, the flight attendant, and told her that her new office at Thorn Global would be ready on Monday. The storm had passed, and for the first time in 20 years, Marcus Thorn finally felt the weight of his brother's memory settle into a peaceful, triumphant silence. The aftermath of the confrontation at the airport settled like the quiet after a devastating storm. Julian Vane's empire didn't just crumble, it vanished. Within months, the viral video of his mid-flight meltdown and his subsequent arrest for filing a false police report became the definitive record of his character. Every investor fled, every social circle closed its doors, and the subsequent civil lawsuits from Thorn Global stripped him of every asset he had spent his life hoarding. The luxury penthouses, the gold-plated phones, and the three-piece suits were auctioned off to pay the legal fees of the very people he had stepped on to reach the top. For Marcus Thorn, however, the victory wasn't found in Julian's bankruptcy, but in the quiet morning he spent at the hospital dedication. Standing before the David Thorn Memorial Wing, Marcus didn't wear a designer suit. He wore his brother's favorite old watch and felt a sense of peace that no amount of money could ever buy. 5 years passed with the steady, relentless rhythm of time. Marcus continued to run Thorn Global with a firm hand but a compassionate heart, often traveling incognito to stay grounded. On a crisp autumn afternoon, he found himself walking through a city park he had helped renovate, the fallen leaves crunching softly beneath his boots. Near the edge of the fountain, he spotted a man in a bright, neon orange mesh vest. The man was hunched over, a long metal trash picker in one hand and a heavy black plastic bag in the other. His skin was weathered by the sun, and his hair had gone prematurely gray. It was Julian Vane, performing his court-ordered community service for the city. Julian didn't look up as Marcus approached. He was too busy chasing a crumpled fast food wrapper that the wind kept dancing just out of his reach. When he finally caught it, he let out a heavy, defeated sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 5 years of regret. Marcus stopped a few feet away, watching him. This wasn't the predator Julian's father had raised him to be. This was just a tired man who had finally learned the true cost of a single hour of arrogance. Marcus reached into his pocket, pulled out a fresh sandwich and a cold bottle of water he had just bought, and held them out. Julian looked up, his eyes squinting against the sunlight. At first, he didn't recognize the man standing before him. He saw only a stranger offering a kindness he hadn't experienced in a very long time. He took the food with trembling hands, his voice a raspy, humble whisper as he said thank you. It was the first time Julian had spoken to Marcus without a sneer, and in that moment, the cycle of hatred was finally broken. Marcus gave a small, respectful nod and continued his walk, leaving Julian to eat his lunch in the quiet shadow of the trees. The lesson was etched into the very skyline of the city. Wealth can be taken, status can be stripped away, and power can vanish in the blink of an eye, but the way you treat another human being is a legacy that lasts forever. The seat you occupy on a plane or in a boardroom does not define your worth. It is the compassion you show to the person sitting next to you that determines your true standing in this world. Marcus looked up as a plane streaked across the blue expanse above, a silver needle sewing the clouds together. He knew now that karma wasn't a punishment, but a mirror, eventually showing everyone exactly who they chose to be. If you see someone struggling, don't look away, and never judge a person by the jacket they wear or the bag they carry. In the end, we are all just passengers on the same journey, and kindness is the only currency that never loses its value.